Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about tabletop role-playing games and what role art plays in a tabletop role-playing game when it's being released for the first time, and what it means for the sales of that game, and is it necessary? Alright, so this is being prompted from specifically from a tweet that came up in my Twitter feed. I'm part of the Dungeons & Dragons Twitter community, the tabletop role-playing game community, the tabletop role-playing game designer community, and so there's a question that came up there from one of the designers, from a tabletop role-playing game designer. I actually hadn't bought any of his previous games, and he said, "Hey, would you buy a game that didn't have art?" Right? And my initial reaction was, I just put the word no. Like, I just wanted to respond, and honestly, it goes against what I like to see in games, and I just don't really feel like it's a good idea. But the more I thought about it, I'm thinking maybe the answer is yes, right? And I really think it brings up a great question, right? So it brings up a lot of great questions. So one of them is, what is the role of art in a tabletop role-playing game? So if you create a tabletop role-playing game and it doesn't have any art, is it a tabletop role-playing game? So actually, there was already some very interesting answers on the tweet thread, and what they got into was, one, they said the Champions game has not had art. The Champions game and the early Travelers game were incredibly art light, right? So that they really didn't functionally have any real art in them, right? And that makes a lot of sense, right? So, and that does answer some questions, right? So one, there's definitely a very small market for people who are just super into rules and the world, right? And they can see it in an abstract way, and it's not necessary to bring art to them. Now, without it, so, there are games that are functionally doing this now, right? That are getting away with very little art. Now, I will say, my absolute favorite tabletop role-playing game company right now, beyond Dungeons & Dragons and Hasbro Gaming, because Dungeons & Dragons holds its own special place, right? But beyond them, my absolute favorite tabletop role-playing game company right now is Roleplaying Games. They're just crushing it with every release. I feel like they're a template for virtually every tabletop role-playing game in the country and the company in the world, right? And they have developed a way where there is art in every single one of their games, but their art is pretty much Sharpie, right? And so I think they've developed a way to make good art, not great art, good art. They've done it very, very quickly, and I think their ability to make it quickly significantly lowers the price, right? Now, Roleplaying Games is cheating a little bit because Brandish Gilhelm he's both a designer and he's an artist, right? So it's hard to hold them up as an example because they have this stellar person who's both a good artist and a good designer. That's incredibly rare. He probably is the only person in the entire industry that can write rules design as well as he can do art. So it's really kind of interesting. But Roleplaying Games has an art style that I think is really unique, and I think a lot of other companies should move toward, right? So but I do want to hit this on the head, and answer the true question. So, should we have tabletop role-playing games that do not have art? And I think the answer is clearly yes. We absolutely should. So one of the things is I just finished a very fantastic article on the numbers, the sales numbers of the tabletop role-playing game industry. In 2018, it looks like, from the best possible guess, the entire tabletop role-playing game industry was about $75 million, right? That's incredibly small. It's half the budget on a single AAA video game. It's an incredibly small market. There are over 85,000 products on... There's over 85,000 products on DriveThruRPG. Those are electronic games, right? Those are PDFs, so those are tabletop role-playing games that you can buy and play electronically, right? And then in addition to that, I also saw a number recently that there were 4,500 adventures published on DM's Guild this year already. That is astounding. That is a lot of adventures for sale on the DM's Guild, on Wizards of the Coast's Hasbro Gaming's DM's Guild, right? pretty amazing, and that stuff pairs with the D&D Beyond, right? So it's really fascinating. It's quite interesting. The reason why I think we really should be thinking more and more about this, about tabletop role-playing games without art, is I think there are, okay, so let's knock it out, right? What's actually in a tabletop role-playing game? So overall, when you're dealing with a tabletop role-playing game, what you're going to be dealing with is you have the rules, you have the world, you have the layout, you have the art, right? And then in addition to that, so you have the art, so that's 4 things. You have rules, world, layout, art, right? Oh, and you know what? There's editing, right? So that's 5. That's 5 core components. That's at least an extremely well executed tabletop role-playing game. At minimum, would have a staff of 5. If you go below that, you are seriously risking making sure that one aspect of your game is really going to be not suitable for public consumption, right? I'm not even saying suitable for sale. I'm saying suitable, to even release, right? And that's another, I didn't even want to get into the whole issue of, you can get a ton of tabletop role-playing games for free right now, right? Just last week, for free, I got Zweihander and Pugmire, right? I could play either one of those games for 6 months. And that's a small amount of play with those games, right? Zweihander is 700 pages long, right? So with those, so just last week, completely for free, legally, these were made available for free on DriveThruRPG, right? That is a year's play for free, and the odds that there won't be more entire tabletop role-playing games released for free. Tales from the Loop was recently released for free. So, right now, you can play full tabletop role-playing games that are 100% released for free, right? Legally, right? So it's astounding. So without a doubt, I think, I now get completely what this designer was talking about. This designer was saying, hey, I want to release this, and I actually want to, and the reality is, he'd worked hard on the world, he'd worked hard on the rules, right? But now he's faced with, if he puts art into this, art can run you $5,000 minimum, right? And honestly, if you go much below that, you get into this zone of why did you even try, right? Because if you go below $5,000 on art on a tabletop role-playing game, it's going to look so slapdash that it really, you're not accomplished. You want to compel people, you want to excite people, right? And I'm a firm believer. I don't think you can do a tabletop role-playing game. I don't think you do a tabletop role-playing game's art for less than $5,000, right? And even at $5,000, you better be firing all cylinders, right? You better find somebody who can deliver a lot of pieces, or a sufficient amount of pieces for a full tabletop role-playing game, who can actually do a large number of pieces and actually execute well, right? It's a big deal. It's very, very difficult, right? So I really totally understood where this TTRPG designer was coming from, and he was saying, hey, I want to release this game, but I don't want to go, Kickstarter this thing and essentially get a bunch of fun. I don't want to raise funds to release this thing when it's so close to being released already, right? So I get that. I absolutely get that, right? And the reality is, this person's doing their layout and they're doing their editing on their, and they're probably getting some help on their layout and their editing, right? But even with that, layout and editing, most tabletop role-playing game designers know somebody who can edit it for them, right? For a low price or a very low price. Just because tabletop role-playing game designers, come on, man, these are super engaged, super intelligent people, right? So the odds that they're going to have somebody who can read through a book and catch some spelling mistakes and maybe say, hey, you should cut this, you should cut that, it's pretty high, right? Layout, there's an app for that. For layout, more and more, that gets easier to do. You can drop your content into a template. You can get great ideas from layouts that you've seen in other games, that kind of stuff. So that's not that critical. It's not critical that you actually do that, right? So the reality is, I definitely think that more and more games should be going for should release without art. And honestly, in my opinion, I think the new path for tabletop role-playing games, for the vast majority of them, for the vast majority of games, you're not going to make your money back as far as all the labor, right? There's well over 1,000 tabletop role-playing games. People are releasing massive, very good tabletop role-playing games for nothing, right? On a regular basis, right? So I think the best path forward right from now on is, if you have a tabletop role-playing game design, you should do the best thing you can to present that thing in 50 pages or less. No art, good solid layout, a good edit job, release it for free, right? Build your community. If people are excited about it and people are playing for it with a free distribution, then do your Kickstarter, right? If you then have your Kickstarter thing, you know that your idea is worthy of art, right? Because I think there are a lot of games right now that are so esoteric and so completely unviable from a commercial perspective that it's just taking energy out of the room. Like, and you're engaging artists, but why, right? And I think there are games that are good games, but they might have a full community of like 500 people in the world, right? Because the scope of the game and the things that are interested in it like are so narrow, right? Like, for instance, I was recently seeing, I think there was a Kickstarter for a tabletop role-playing game that was about like Canadians in World War II, right? That, a lot of people don't like to be in tabletop role-playing games beyond genre stuff, right? So this is based in the real world. You're cutting out a large part of the audience right there. And then you're saying not just a World War II game, which you're going to need some history buffs for. You're like ones who are super into Canada, right? Like, that's a small group. That is not a large group of people, right? So, like, to me, I think it might have been a better idea to release that game without art, right? Like, and scale it up. See if the community was there. See if people could be engaged first. So the more I think about it, I really think that the future of tabletop role-playing games should be games being released without art for free in a super boiled down Redux version, right? And then, the super boiled down Redux version. And then, in addition to that, then actually going to Kickstarter if there is an engaged community of over 1,000 players, right? Because, like, some ideas are just so small. Like, here's a perfect example, right? I own a game. It's one of my favorite games. I love it. It's really fantastic. Chronicles of the Void, right? Chronicles of the Void was released probably 4 or 5 years ago, and I was so down for that game. I read the entire book. I ran a campaign, and then, like, after I completed the campaign, like, literally 1 year after its release, I went to connect with the creators. The creators were gone. Like the people who created that game had just kind of disappeared from Twitter. There was really no game community. That game just, it was ironically called Chronicles of the Void because it seemed like the entire design team just kind of disappeared into the void. And that game went nowhere, right? Like, so the idea that they did this Kickstarter, they completed the game and all that, and then it came out and it was a good game. But I think one of the things that we're seeing right now is really good, incredibly good games are being drowned. They're being drowned completely. They don't have the attention they need, right? And so I really think this is a good path. I think more games should be released without art, but a game without art should be released for free, in my opinion. And then there should be like a 6-month period to see if a community develops around that game, and then take it to Kickstarter. I think it's a better path for a lot of creators, right? Because the reality is, I think a ton of creators make incredibly small amounts of money on their games, right? And it really begs the question of maybe this is a hobby and this isn't an occupation, right? And I think we should start to detach the stigma of being a hobby TTRPG game designer, because that's what's happening to a lot of people despite their efforts to make that their occupation. So I think it was a really good question. I appreciate you letting me take the time to share these ideas with you. Please consider putting your ideas of what you think on this topic. Would you buy a tabletop role-playing game with no art? What would you pay for it? Do you think it's a good idea? Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.